When the narcissist knows that you know, and I want to begin with the specific dynamic this title is pointing at, because knowing that you know is one of the most psychologically significant moments available in the entire arc of a narcissistic relationship, and its significance runs in both directions simultaneously. It is significant for you because the knowing represents the arrival of the clarity that the dynamic was specifically organized to prevent. And it is significant for the narcissist because your knowing represents the specific threat to the construction that the construction's entire management system was built to defend against. The moment when the narcissist realizes that the management system has failed, that you have arrived at an accurate understanding of what has been happening and who they actually are underneath the construction, is the moment this episode is entirely about. Let's be precise about what the knowing actually consists of, because not all knowledge of a narcissist's behavior produces the specific reaction this episode is describing. General awareness that a person is narcissistic, that the dynamic has unhealthy features, that the relationship is not what it presents itself as. This awareness is common enough in relationships with narcissists and produces a response from the narcissist system that is relatively well managed. The counter-narrative, the reality contestation, the reframing of your awareness as your misperception, all of these are deployed efficiently when the knowing is general and incomplete. The knowing that produces the specific reaction this episode is about is something more precise than general awareness. It is the specific, detailed, accurately assembled understanding of the mechanism, of how it actually operates, of the specific tools and the specific sequences and the specific calibrations that the dynamic was running, of the gap between the presented self and what is actually there, of the particular way that your specific vulnerabilities were identified and engaged, of the supply economics that were structuring the relationships functioning underneath the presentation of something else. This level of knowing is different in kind from general awareness, and the narcissist system reads the difference accurately even when the narcissist cannot consciously articulate what they are reading. They know you know, not because you have said so, because something in how you are moving through the interactions between you has changed in the specific way that accurate, detailed, mechanism-level knowing produces. The first thing that happens when the narcissist knows that you know is the specific, immediate activation of what I would describe as the containment response. Not the denial response, which is what most people expect, and which the narcissist deploys in situations where the knowing is general and incomplete enough that denial has a reasonable chance of producing the desired effect. The containment response is different because the narcissist system has detected that the knowing is detailed and accurate enough that denial alone is not going to be sufficient. The containment response is the system's assessment that the knowing needs to be managed rather than simply denied, contained within a frame. That reduces its threat to the construction without requiring the direct confrontation of denying something that the other person's accuracy would make denial implausible. The containment frame is almost always some version of the same structure. The knowing is acknowledged, partially and implicitly, in a way that is simultaneously recast as something other than what it is. Your understanding of the mechanism is reframed as your interpretation, rather than your accurate perception. Your knowledge of the gap between the presented self and the actual self is reframed as your uncharitable reading of someone who is more complicated than your reading allows. Your accurate assembly of the pattern is reframed as a narrative you have constructed that reflects your own needs rather than the relationship's actual functioning. The containment does not deny that you see something. It denies that what you see is what you think it is. And the distinction between those two strategies, denial of the seeing versus reframing of what the seeing perceives, is the distinction between the response to general awareness and the response to mechanism-level knowing. The more complete the knowing, the more the containment replaces the denial. The second thing that happens when the narcissist knows that you know is the specific quality of behavioral change that the mechanism-level knowing produces in the narcissist's interactions with you. Not a dramatic change, not the obvious sudden shift that would itself confirm the knowing by demonstrating that something significant has been detected. A subtle change, a specific quality of increased care in the management of the interactions, the presentation slightly more polished than usual, the calibration slightly more precise, the specific attentiveness of someone who is aware that they are being observed more accurately than they are accustomed to being observed. The narcissist who knows that you know begins performing, for the first time, for an audience that sees the performance. And performing for an audience that sees the performance requires a different quality of effort than performing for an audience that takes the performance at face value. It is more effortful, more specifically managed. And the increased effort is perceptible, not always in ways the knowing person can immediately articulate, but in the specific quality of something that is slightly too careful, slightly too organized, slightly too managed to be the natural expression it is presenting itself as. The third thing, and the one that is most revealing and most specifically honest about what the narcissist knows that you know produces in the interior of their psychology, is the activation of what I would describe as the actual self's recognition. The actual self, the wounded, defended, largely inaccessible self underneath the construction, has its own response to the knowing, different from the construction's containment response, different from the behavioral management of the interactions. The actual self's response is something closer to relief than anything else available in the narcissist's psychology. Not a comfortable relief, not a relief that produces openness or genuine reconnection, or the beginning of the reckoning that the knowing might seem to point toward. A complicated, defended, almost immediately suppressed relief that something real has been seen, that the actual self, for once, does not need to be entirely concealed because the person in the room has already seen past the concealment. That the exhausting, continuous, resource-consuming project of presenting the construction as though it were the whole of what is there is temporarily, briefly, almost unbearably unnecessarily in the presence of someone who already knows it is not. This relief is real. It surfaces in the specific moments when the construction's management of the interaction is at its most effortful and produces a brief, unguarded quality in the narcissist's engagement that is different from everything else the interaction contains. A moment of genuine contact, of something underneath the construction briefly meeting something in you that it recognizes as having seen it accurately. The moment is brief. The construction reasserts. The management resumes. But the moment was there, and the knowing person, with their specific perceptive capacity, feels it even when they cannot immediately name what they felt. What the narcissist does with the knowing over time, and how the containment response develops as the knowing proves to be more durable than the containment's initial deployment anticipated, and what it means for the relationship's subsequent trajectory. These are the questions that the knowing opens rather than closes. Because the knowing is not the end of the dynamic, it is the beginning of its most honest phase, the phase in which the construction knows it is being seen and must decide what to do with being seen. And what the construction does with being seen, whether it doubles down on the management or whether the relief of the actual self's recognition produces something that the management had always been preventing, is the most variable and the most specifically human element in the entire psychology of what happens when the narcissist knows that you know. And that variability, and what it depends on, and what the person who holds the knowing does with it while the narcissist system is deciding, that is exactly where this conversation deserves to go next. What the construction does with being seen unfolds across a specific and recognizable sequence. And understanding the sequence is what allows the person who holds the knowing to navigate what follows with the clarity the knowing deserves, rather than being pulled back into the dynamic by the specific, sophisticated responses the construction produces when it realizes the concealment has failed. The construction's first sustained response to being seen is the attempt to reabsorb the knowing into the relationship on terms that the construction can manage. This is different from the initial containment response we discussed, which was primarily about reducing the threat of the knowing in the moment of its detection. The reabsorption attempt is more sustained and more specifically relational. It is the construction's effort to incorporate the knowing person's accurate perception into a version of the relationship that the construction can continue to govern. The most common form of this attempt is what might be called the managed vulnerability, the specific, carefully calibrated presentation of self-awareness that acknowledges just enough of what the knowing person knows to seem genuine, while stopping well short of the full acknowledgement that genuine accountability would require. The narcissist begins using the language of self-reflection. References to their own patterns appear in conversation with a frequency that was not present before the knowing was detected. Acknowledgments of past behavior arrive in the specific register of someone who is processing something genuinely, though the processing, on close examination, has a quality of performance that the genuine article does not have. It is organized around the knowing person's reception of it, rather than around the honest reckoning it presents itself as being. It is watching you for signs that the acknowledgement is producing the specific response it was designed to produce. The softening, the re-engagement, the opening that the managed vulnerability was specifically calibrated to create. The knowing person who has genuine mechanism-level understanding feels the difference between the managed vulnerability and the genuine article. Not always immediately, not always in a way they can immediately articulate, but in the body, in the specific quality of something that is slightly too organized to be the spontaneous self-revelation it presents itself as, in the awareness that the acknowledgement is arriving in the moments and the registers that the history of the relationship would predict would be most effective, rather than in the moments and the registers that genuine processing would produce. The managed vulnerability is the construction's most sophisticated response to being seen. It is more sophisticated than denial, which the knowing makes implausible. More sophisticated than the containment reframe, which the knowing makes increasingly difficult to maintain. It is the construction incorporating the knowing into a new presentation of self that uses the knowing as material rather than being genuinely altered by it. What the person who holds the knowing does in the face of the managed vulnerability is the most important decision the knowing produces. Because the managed vulnerability is specifically designed to create a specific pull, the pull of finally being in a relationship where the seeing is mutual, where the knowing is shared, where the gap between the presented self and the actual self is being honestly acknowledged. This pull is real. The desire for the mutuality it presents is real. The hope it activates, that the knowing has produced what the knowing seemed like it should produce, is real. And the pull, the desire, and the hope are all in the service of a presentation that is organized around producing them. Rather than around the genuine reckoning they are presenting themselves as evidence of. The response to the managed vulnerability that serves the knowing person best is neither the complete rejection of what is being presented, nor the full acceptance of it at face value. It is the specific, grounded, patient assessment of whether the managed vulnerability is accompanied by behavioral evidence over time that the acknowledgement is genuine, not words. Behavior. Consistent, sustained, not contingent on your reception behavior that demonstrates the pattern is actually shifting rather than being presented as shifting. This assessment takes time. It takes the specific patience of someone who knows that genuine change in a narcissist psychology, when it occurs at all, is visible in behavior across enough time and enough varied contexts that the performance cannot sustain it. And it takes the specific willingness to hold the knowing steady through the pull of the managed vulnerabilities presentation, to not allow the sophistication of the presentation to replace the clarity of the knowing, with the hope that the presentation was designed to activate. The actual self's response to being seen, the brief, complicated, almost immediately suppressed relief we discussed, does something over time that is worth acknowledging honestly, because dismissing it entirely would be a disservice to the complexity of what the narcissist actually is. When the person who holds the knowing maintains their position with sufficient steadiness and sufficient genuine presence, not as a strategy, not as a tactic designed to produce a specific outcome, but as the natural expression of someone who is genuinely clear about what they know and genuinely grounded in that clarity. The actual self's access to the surface increases slightly, not dramatically, not in ways that transform the relationship into something fundamentally different from what it has been. But the actual self, in the presence of someone whose knowing makes the full performance of the construction partially unnecessary, has slightly more access to the interactions than it usually has. The moments of genuine contact become slightly more frequent. The moments when something underneath the construction makes brief, unguarded appearance become slightly less immediately retracted. This is not healing. It is not the beginning of the genuine change that would require the professional engagement and the sustained reckoning that the actual self's exposure to another person cannot produce on its own. But it is real. It is the most specifically human thing available in a relationship where the knowing has been established and held with sufficient steadiness that the construction has had to accommodate it. What all of this means for the person who holds the knowing is ultimately simpler than the complexity of what the knowing produces in the narcissist's psychology might suggest. The knowing is yours. It was arrived at through genuine perception and genuine experience and the specific work of assembling what was perceived and experienced into an accurate understanding of what was actually happening. It belongs to you, and what you do with it, whether you remain in the relationship and observe how the construction responds to being seen over time, whether you use the knowing as the foundation of a distance that the knowing makes clearly necessary, whether you hold the knowing as simply the most complete understanding of what happened available to you as you build the life that comes after. Whatever you do with it, the knowing itself is not something that the construction's response to it can take from you, not the managed vulnerability that presents itself as mutual knowing, not the reabsorption attempt that tries to incorporate your seeing into a version of the relationship the construction can govern. Not the containment frame that reinterprets your accuracy as your narrative. None of it touches the knowing, because the knowing is not organized around the construction's response to it. It is organized around what is actually true, and what is actually true does not require the construction's agreement to remain true. It simply is. As it was before the construction knew you knew it, as it will be regardless of everything the construction does now that it knows. Yours, permanently. The most complete and most specifically protective thing the relationship ultimately produced, not despite everything the dynamic cost. Because of everything the work of understanding it required, the knowing is the return on that investment, and it is worth considerably more than the dynamic that produced it ever was.